This is the
Five Stars
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
We're going to start the show this week with something I don't think I've ever done before. It is entirely possible that it'll hit me with a copyright strike, but I think it's worth it to get across a point that I've been making on this channel for quite a while now. I watched a video clip that came out a few days ago on the Wrestling Observer's Figure 4 YouTube page, and it just really kind of set me over the edge. It also validated a lot of my criticisms of the way the wrestling media has covered AEW's product since its inception. You know, we've heard people passively joke about the way that wrestling journalists and podcasts handle AEW news and talk about their TV shows every week. You know, whether you want to say they're in the tank for the company or they're apologists for a lot of things they do wrong, especially the things that we know damn good and well. If WWE did the exact same thing, these same journalists would rake them over the coals for it, as they should. And there's certainly something to be said about that. They'll deny it, because that's what any kind of biased media or biased journalist does when they try to spin things in their favor to cover a story or an ulterior motive. It's the same thing we see in mainstream media covering politics on a day-to-day basis. And if you're a smart person and you're actually interested in getting to the truth, to figure out the facts to anything, you will make a concerted effort to listen to as many sources as possible from both extremes. You know, there's an old saying that once proposed the notion that the truth is always somewhere in the middle. And whenever I'm trying to read or listen to people's perspectives on AEW's product, I'm always trying to branch out and get as many perspectives as I can, because despite how my reviews of AEW can come across every week, I can assure you right now, as I've said many times when talking about the show, I want AEW to succeed. I truly want AEW to be a real, viable alternative to WWE in the same way that every other true wrestling fan does. But I'm also not going to sit here every week, blow smoke up your ass, and pretend like AEW's television show is a good program. Because it's not. Discount the MJFs and the CM Punks and the Bryan Danielsons of the world on a week-to-week basis. AEW Dynamite and Rampage are horribly written professional wrestling programs. We usually get good wrestling, although we can debate what constitutes good wrestling these days, but by and large, the wrestling isn't normally the problem for me. It's everything in between that is supposed to make a good wrestling program that AEW misses with. Their storylines suck. Their weekly progression of follow-ups and recaps to explain angles are atrocious. Their ability to get characters over and make people care about what's going on is a constant failure. And for all the things that people want to talk about, how AEW always puts together a packed show from top to bottom, that's probably my biggest complaint about AEW in general. There's too much going on, nothing ever has room to breathe, and as I just talked about a second ago, because they're always trying to constantly cram in 1,000 things in a given program, nothing is ever properly followed up on from week to week, which makes it virtually impossible to care or get invested into anything that goes on. People appear and disappear at random, stories come and go with no rhyme or reason. And then you start running into the problem with what's been going on with the build to the Forbidden Door show. The problem being that you're trying to cram in a bunch of New Japan guys on your television show to come up with some kind of artificially contrived card for a pay-per-view coming up in less than 5 days, and all the stories that you were focusing on prior to the Double or Nothing show, it's all taking a back seat. Your roster is intentionally taking a back seat to New Japan's roster. Do you see a problem with that? You know, while I was trying to come up with a laundry list of ways to sort of vent my frustrations about the whole concept of the Forbidden Door show. This clip from the Figure 4 painted the entire picture of what my problem is. The clip was taken from this week's edition of Figure 4's podcast, which is called We're Live, Pal. The hosts, I believe, are Garrett Gonzalez and Andrew Zarian. Hopefully I'm pronouncing his name right. I should note that I don't listen to these guys from week to week. This is my first actual listen to their commentary here, but they had Brian Alvarez on as a guest. And I do listen to Brian all the time. And I like Brian. I enjoy listening to his shows. I check out the occasional Observer Live clips every week with him and Mike Sempervive. Don't always agree with everything he says, but he certainly got his head screwed on more straight than Dave Meltzer and all his nonsensical NPR droning. But the clip here is all centered around the build to the Forbidden Door show. And they had Brian on to share his thoughts about the whole thing, and I'm listening to this conversation he's having with Andrew and Garrett, and I'm just shaking my head the entire time because the conversation is baffling to me. The whole premise of the discussion is AEW is hosting a cross-promotional pay-per-view with New Japan Pro Wrestling where the entire thing is built around matches that the fans don't really want to see because politics, basically. So I've segmented a couple clips. I'm going to touch on some of the key talking points. The video's not that long, but again, I want you all to understand. These are the main wrestling media outlets that are covering AEW's product right now. These are our credible news sources that we're supposed to take seriously.
Places where I am on the internet. A little bit unhappy with some of the matches, maybe the build. Obviously, AEW's dealing with a bunch of injuries at the same time. But Brian, as somebody who's talking about this a lot, what is your sense of the build? Do you like the build of the show? Do you think that there's things that they could do better? Are you ultimately sort of happy going into this this weekend with what they've done so far?
Well, before I came on, you were talking about the tendency to talk about the same thing over and over.
Right.
And I do a lot of shows, and I hate repeating something that I said on another show. But the problem is it's practically impossible to not repeat things. And when you ask this question, I have to repeat something that I've said a million times, which is the day that this show was announced, I talked to somebody there who's fairly high up. And they said, fans guaranteed are going to be disappointed that they're not going to get this match, they're not going to get this dream match, and they're not going to get those matches. But when the show's over, I think that they're going to be very happy with the show. And that's what I heard on day one. That's what I believe today. I think when Forbidden Door is over, it's going to end up having been like a great wrestling show. But you're not going to get those matches that you dreamed of. There's too much politics involved. There's the normal New Japan AAA politics. There's New Japan and AEW, which they're working together, but each side has guys that they don't want to lose to somebody else. And so you've got to say, okay, these are the guys I don't care if you beat. These are the guys I don't want you to beat. Okay, well, now we have to put these guys together.
So there's a lot in that one clip alone, but let's just start with the main gist of the whole thing. Taken directly from Brian's mouth. From the day this show was announced, the fans were going to be, quote, disappointed, unquote, because, quote, they weren't going to get the matches they wanted to see, unquote. Which, first of all, coming from the same company that vowed from the beginning that they were going to actually listen to the fans and give them what they wanted, unlike those ungrateful pricks up in Stamford that constantly spit in the fans' faces and give them 1,800 renditions of Brock Lesnar versus Roman Reigns. But this whole thing is just ridiculous because as soon as I heard Brian drop that line about how the fans were going to be upset that they weren't going to get all these New Japan versus AEW dream matches, the first thing I immediately asked was, so why the fuck are we even doing the show then? Think about it. The build to the show is you guys will not get the matches you want because whoever's president of New Japan, I think his name's Obari, Obari isn't letting Tony Khan put his top guys over New Japan's top guys. So instead of taking the time to sit down and work out an actual agreement where New Japan and AEW could do some actual promotional work together in a cohesive talent exchange, instead it's AEW and New Japan meets watered down WWF versus WCW Invasion pay-per-view circa 2001. And I have a lot more to say about the whole concept of the Forbidden Door show in another clip, but right from the jump, in the first 2 minutes of this clip, Brian Alvarez just planted the question in every wrestling fan's mind that has not been paying attention to New Japan and is only currently watching AEW's product. Why is this show happening? And especially if we aren't going to get actual top caliber matches from New Japan's roster, why would we even care? So here's the next clip.
We had a guest host on last week. We've had Lance on, and both of them said the same thing, which is, I don't watch a lot of New Japan. And I watch Dynamite, and I see these people, and I'm like, who is this? What is going on? Who are these people? And you're going to have the issue the first year. Because, as we've talked about a million times, the way New Japan books, they're not going to go beyond whatever their next show is. So until that Dominion show happened, I mean, you can't start the build to Forbidden Door until Dominion's over. And it was the same thing with AEW and Double or Nothing. So they've had like 3-4 weeks to put this entire thing together. And that, by the way, is not like a normal pay-per-view. You have to introduce new characters. You have to get New Japan people on the show. You have to, get them involved with the current AEW guys to set up matches. So the first year was invariably going to be like this. There's going to be a lot of people on TV that fans, they're not going to know who the Great Okan is. They're not going to know who Jeff Cobb is. Some of them aren't even going to know who, like, Tanahashi is. They don't watch New Japan. When we have another year of AEW and New Japan working together, and then a year from now you start doing the build towards Forbidden Door, and now it's guys that you know this guy, you know that guy. I think it's going to be a lot better next year. I think this is just going to be a tough year for all of those reasons.
Hold on. Wait a sec. Hold the phone, Chico. It's going to be a lot better next year? This is going to be an annual thing? I just thought it was like a one and done blow off, but now you're telling me that I'm going to have to be subjected to several weeks of lousy to bad television to build up to a bunch of New Japan guys getting matches with AEW's roster every fucking year? And by the way, even if Tony is in a working relationship with New Japan, it still doesn't address the key issue that Brian literally just brought up in the first minute of the clip. He just talked about the politics that are going to come into play with not allowing certain guys to do jobs, fans not getting the matches they want to see, that whole deal. So what's going to change between now and next year that would alter that in any way? Aren't we just going to run into the same problem every year where it's going to be the same political game where the fans are going to want to see certain top names paired together from both companies, but they won't be able to do it because you're going to run into the problem of both parties not wanting their designated top guys doing jobs? I'm confused as to how things are going to be better in the next year when no one's even mentioning how the playing field is going to be changed in any way in the next 12 months. Moreover, here's my question. If the concern with the whole thing is the New Japan president not wanting his top guys losing to AEW's top guys, then fuck him. Why are we even bothering with this whole charade? The fuck good is it doing AEW's overall bottom line anyway if these top guys can't beat New Japan's top guys? Wouldn't Tony be using his resources more wisely if he just focused on trying to get over his guys instead? I mean, he's only got 800 people signed to a contract right now. Figure at some point or another, he'd try to get at least 50 of those guys over, instead of wasting his time worrying about who he has to play second fiddle to in the hierarchy of New Japan's cesspool of a garbage roster that nobody gives a crap about. I mean, come on now, seriously. I mean, Brian said the quiet part out loud early on when he was mentioning his co-host coming in and saying that they don't even really know who half these guys from New Japan are anyway. Because nobody cares. And they haven't given us a reason to care. And I don't care if they plan on doing this show next year, 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years from now. As long as they don't bother explaining who any of these guys are, what their stories are, what their characters are, why anyone should give a fuck, they can run this Forbidden Door pay-per-view concept into the ground. It's not going to matter. But of course, everything I'm saying doesn't matter. Because we've pretty much established at this point, it is a niche pay-per-view for a niche product that's not going to grow or expand its audience beyond where it is right now. So, the marks are going to buy the show. They'll pay full pay-per-view price to see a bunch of lousy mid-card AEW versus New Japan TV matches, and they'll be blissful in their viewing experience because they'll get to see a bunch of great wrestling matches. Because that's all that matters now, right? Storylines, compelling characters, compelling TV angles, compelling promos, packages to get you invested into the hype of the first ever collab project between AEW and New Japan. Nah, fuck that. As long as everyone's doing flips and stunts and kicking out of everything and no-selling everything and exposing the business to the nth degree, who cares? Because there are no standards in wrestling anymore. Everyone gets to play along, regardless of skill or ability. And all the things that used to actually generate money in the business, that's all bullshit now. As long as people are in their little bubbles marking out for moves. And again, I like Brian Alvarez. Always enjoy hearing his opinions, but his coverage of AEW in this conversation really starts to enter that whole apologetic discussion that people like to bring up. Instead of holding them accountable and demanding better, he's beating around the bush about the whole thing. The same list of things that I just mentioned that Brian used to skewer TNA for back in the day when he used to rant about how god-awful that television program was. And trust me, it was fucking rotten. But what things did I mention here that TNA Impact Wrestling didn't do back in the late 2000s that aren't comparable in any way? Bad booking, poorly written television programs, terribly written storylines, characters that you're given no reason to care about, and pay-per-view cards with a bunch of mediocre matches that have horrible build-up, that people have to pay full pay-per-view price to see. I mean, Russo's ADHD used to be out of control back in the day, but to sit here and try and argue that Tony doesn't have the same problem? Laughable, dude. I watched this show every fucking week. And I remember some of those terrible episodes of Impact back in the day. That was a wretchedly put together television program. I will not defend Impact Wrestling, TNA Wrestling, whatever you want to call it. Go back and watch them, people. They were bad. But when I compare it to what I'm seeing right now with AEW Dynamite every week, only difference is we might get some better quality wrestling matches on Dynamite once in a blue moon. And maybe because we've set the standards so low, the bar is lowered to the point it is now in 2022, people are okay with that. But I'm not accepting that. So with that all said, God damn it, now I guess I have to talk about Dynamite. By the way, before we even get into anything, just to kind of wrap a bow around this whole Forbidden Door discussion from earlier, the pay-per-view is less than 5 days away, everybody. 4 days as of this recording. Other than Tanahashi versus Moxley in the absolute joke of a match that's Ospreay versus Orange fucking Cassidy, I have no idea what's on that card. By the end of the night, all I knew is that there are a bunch of multi-person matches where if I didn't know any better, I'd have figured that in order for Tony to have come up with those matches, all he did was take AEW's roster, New Japan's roster, put everyone's name on a spin the wheel gimmick, and whatever the pointer landed on, that was the match that was being booked for the pay-per-view. There's like no thought process into any of this. I'm 90% sure that there are guys that are booked for that card on Sunday that have not made one single appearance on Dynamite at all. And to tell you the truth, if that show does anything other than a moderately bad buy rate, I will fucking eat my own toenails. So I guess it should be an omen as to what kind of show we're dealing with this week. I do know the show started off great. The only real star on this show right now, outside Punk and MJF, it's Bryan Danielson out for a special announcement. And just to let us all know that Danielson is in on the gag, he takes the microphone from Tony Schiavone and deliberately tells him to pound sand because he's not going to give it back. Only Danielson can pull that line off. And he starts by putting over the pay-per-view on Sunday. Talks about the big War Games, Blood and Guts cage match for next week's Dynamite. To which I said, oh yes, of course. They're doing a War Games match on free television with 7 days build. Classic AEW right there. I did kind of chuckle at Danielson's line early on where he goes, on Sunday, you're going to see some great professional wrestling, and then next week on Dynamite, you're going to see the exact opposite. So even Danielson recognizes how shitty that War Games match is going to be. He had also mentioned that he was initially slated to wrestle Zack Sabre Jr. at the pay-per-view, but he will not be partaking in either of those matches, the pay-per-view or the War Games match, because he's still apparently dealing with some injuries right now and has not been medically cleared to compete. So he tells us not to fear, because despite the fact that he can't be involved with either show, can't or doesn't want to be, you can decipher that of your own volition, but he can still out-wrestle, out-read, outrun, and outperform every single person on the roster, which is a proven statistical fact. And anyone that wants to try and argue that can blow me. And then he closed his semi-babyface promo by saying that he has a replacement opponent for Zack at the pay-per-view, but he's not going to tell the fans because he came out through the heel entrance tunnel, which means that in kayfabe, he's still technically a bad guy, even though he's been feuding with a bunch of heels on television, but Christ, who even knows at this point what side of the fence half these fuckers are on? But leave it to Bryan Danielson to cut a promo acknowledging that he will not be wrestling at either the pay-per-view or on next week's Dynamite in the Blood and Guts match, and that he's not going to reveal his replacement opponent for the pay-per-view, but that people should still order to see who it is. Yet it's still the best thing on the entire show by a country mile. Well, the Christian thing was pretty damn great too, so it's probably a toss-up. Hopefully we do end up getting to see that match at some point, because I would very much enjoy watching a Zack Sabre-Bryan Danielson match. Talked about it before. I thought Zack was the MVP of last year's G1 tournament. He's not the biggest guy in the world, but his shit always looks good. He takes his work seriously, and he knows how to actually work the crowd. I've seen it firsthand. So hopefully they don't try and wait an entire year to do that match, because Danielson's not getting any younger. You know, with the injury streak that guy's had in the last 7 or 8 years, he's a case of just get it done while you still have the opportunity, because who even knows where we're going to be in the next 12 months with any of these guys on the roster? And what's that old metaphor that we like to bring up? From the penthouse to the outhouse. We go from Bryan Danielson, the only redeeming quality on this program right now during the absence of MJF and Punk, to Orange Cassidy, the dirt worst of everything that is modern pro wrestling. He was out with an injury. He was not greatly missed in the slightest, but we all knew that as soon as he got cleared, Tony was going to be champing at the bit to get that POS back on television. It's a trios match with Roppongi Vice and Cassidy against Will Ospreay and friends. I was at least able to discern that their team name is Aussie Open, but beyond that, no clue what the guys' individual names are. I got about 2 minutes into the match, and as soon as Cassidy tagged in and started doing all his usual unwatchable antics, I just skipped through the rest of the segment because I can only watch Cassidy act like a dipshit for so long before I start getting the urge to slit my wrists open. It also infuriated me to see FTR out there participating in all this hot garbage, but I mean, I didn't spend enough time watching what they did here to get mad at them. It's got to be deliberate on Tony's part, though. Involving FTR and Orange Cassidy together in the same segment, no way that's not intentional. That is a deliberate fuck you to all the real wrestling fans out there that have nothing but good things to say about Dax and Cash because, unlike Orange Cassidy, FTR is actually talented. So Tony can piss right off for booking this. But then we quickly turn the show back around. We got Christian Cage out to do some mansplaining. And we now know what caused Christian to finally turn on Jungle Boy after like an entire year of speculation and wondering when the actual turn was going to happen. He's pissed off that Jungle Boy eliminated him from a battle royal. That's all. You waited an entire year to lay out Jungle Boy for that? Does anyone, excluding the marks, actually remember that angle? I don't. What battle royal was Christian even talking about? We've seen like 17 battle royals from AEW since company inception. I had no idea what Christian was talking about here. Didn't we just see Swerve Strickland eliminate Keith Lee from a battle royal like 3 weeks ago? And those guys are still teaming. He did at least spice up that statement about the battle royal by insinuating that he also took a significant pay cut by not winning the battle royal. So it's one of those "you took food off my family's table" heel lines, just dressed up a bit more. Anyway, looking past that, he talks about some other pent-up frustrations he's been dealing with when it comes to Jungle Boy. He mentions that he would constantly check social media and see how much people raved about how great Jungle Boy was, so he wanted to hitch himself to that wagon and hop on board. Great heel stuff when he says that the people thought he signed with AEW to help out the young generation of guys, but the reality is he's a smart businessman. He signed to make a shit ton of money. Nothing more, nothing less. But he does have some offerings for the young guys in the back. He says, try having a match that people remember the week after it happens and can actually sell some fucking tickets. Sound advice to me. And I had actually seen the clip of the little post-show angle they shot on AEW's YouTube page, but they aired it here on TV where Christian confronted Jungle Boy's mom and sister at ringside, and this is just fantastic heel work. Telling Jungle Boy's family, you raised a piece of shit. And the girls are sitting there motherfucking and flipping the guy off. I mean, it wasn't the most believable thing in the world, and I'd have probably suggested the girls at least try to hop the barricade or something to make it actually look like they were concerned about what had happened, but I mean, that's just nitpicky stuff at the end of the day. And of course, Christian drops the low ball line about how Jungle Boy used to look up to him as a father. But the problem is, Jungle Boy has a father, and he's dead. God, it's such a brutal line, but boy, did it get a reaction. You could tell those people were pissed about that. And he tops it off perfectly with saying it's probably a good thing he's dead because he'd be ashamed to see what a worthless, low-life scumbag his son grew up to be. I mean, I know there's a lot of touchy material in there, but god damn it. This was a fucking heel promo. This is what everyone should be aspiring to do to actually get a reaction from the crowd. And anyone out there that says, oh no, this crossed the line, it went too far, they shouldn't have brought up Jungle Boy's dad, eat shit. Go back and listen to old heel promos from the boys when they used to know how to do it right. Tell me they didn't know how to draw heat. Cross the line. Bunch of pussies. No, this promo got heat. This promo got a reaction. And when Jungle Boy finally makes his comeback and he gets his hands on Christian, he's going to get a massive babyface pop. Now, they got a real opportunity to salvage his career here, and it all started with Christian delivering this Dynamite promo to set it up. Now, the stuff with the dinosaur at the end, I don't really know about all that. You know, the novelty of the Jurassic Express is kind of worn off for me in recent months. And Luchasaurus, I mean, I don't dislike the guy. He's got a cool gimmick, and the chemistry with him and Jungle Boy works, but I don't really have much of a desire to see him involved with this program at all. I mean, obviously, Jungle Boy was going to be the bigger investment coming out of that team when they eventually broke him up, but I don't really need to see Luchasaurus involved with this. Just let Christian work his magic, give Jungle Boy an actual major career-defining win that will actually elevate his profile, and I don't know, let the dinosaur kind of fade into extinction because I'm kind of over the whole act now. So then we get Malachi Black and Penta O Screwball in, I believe what Dasha said was a qualifying match in the All-Atlantic Championship tournament, even though these guys are already in the actual tournament, and it's not even a real tournament because the finals are just a 4-way at the pay-per-view. Anyway, I believe this is Malachi's first singles match since he lost to Cody last year. And from the time I saw that feud blow off to the point we're at right now, I don't think I've ever wanted to see Malachi less than I do right now. And again, this is coming from somebody whose favorite wrestler in NXT used to be Malachi. Of course, we went by Alistair back then, but you get my point. You know, everything he's been involved with in AEW post-Cody has been absolute garbage. Now, the actual wrestling in the match was mostly fine. Again, I just talked about this at the beginning of the podcast. The wrestling usually is not the problem when it comes to AEW's matches. There's obviously the exceptions with guys doing all the phony gymnastic BS that I complain about, but I mean, they've at least noticeably toned that down in the last year or so. But it's everything surrounding the wrestling that usually sucks and makes it impossible to care about anything that's going on. That's the problem. It's pretty obvious that Penta fucked up his back here at some point. Probably because it's the most selling I've ever seen the guy do. I'm not exactly sure what he did. I remember he did some kind of diving plancha to the floor at one point and kind of landed awkwardly on his tailbone, so that might have been the cause. It's why these guys should stop doing all the high-risk shit in their matches and just learn how to properly work. Maybe half the roster wouldn't be injured by default, but Malachi won with the Black Mass, which was the right call. And then Pac ran out to stand over Penta while Miro showed up on the Tron and did another promo on God. So the pay-per-view match is a 4-way between Miro, Pac, Malachi, and I think they said Tomohiro Ishii is the 4th guy in the match. And the winner becomes the Almost Atlantic Champion. My money is on Miro. My level of care is on another planet. We had Hangman Page versus Silas Young. And once again, I revert back to every comment I've ever made about new talent that just randomly shows up on this show with no context or explanation. Who is Silas Young? Where did he come from? What is his backstory and why should I care? We got answers to none of these questions. We just get a passing graphic at the bottom of the screen that reads, Hangman Page versus Silas Young tonight. And that's all the explanation we got. And we wonder why nobody on the show gets over. Now that said, I've always liked Silas Young. I think I first saw him back in Ring of Honor during the latter half of the Cornette era. Whether or not he was a Cornette recruit, I don't know. Judging by the look of the guy and the way he works, I have to assume he was a Cornette project. Guy's a great athlete, and while I know his moniker is wrestling's last real man, at least he looks like a fucking grown-ass man. I mean, certainly if I were running a territory, I'd be using Silas Young on my show in some capacity. I probably wouldn't push him as a main event guy or anything like that, but he'd be a great mid-card / upper mid-card heel. He's a textbook example of a guy that if Tony Khan were smart, he'd be using all the time on his show, but because he's not smart, this will probably be the last time we see Silas on AEW for like the next 7 months. It's another perfectly fine match, and they weren't breaking down any barriers or setting the world on fire with anything they did, but it was grassroots professional wrestling, and that's all it needed to be. I still shake my head every time Paige does that blind moonsault to the floor. A, because I'm always afraid he's going to tweak his ankle on the landing, and B, it's a stupid move because he's essentially putting stock in the idea that the guy's going to be willingly standing behind him to catch him. But Paige goes over clean with the buckshot. Again, gives him another win coming off the loss to Punk at the Double or Nothing pay-per-view, so it's good they're keeping him fresh with TV wins. I will also note, there's something oddly comedic about Adam Cole and Tony Schiavone spouting back and forth on commentary. I don't know what it is, but they actually have moderately decent chemistry together. But of course, they can never leave well enough alone. Because immediately after the match, Adam Cole calls for them to cut the music, and he's about to do a story time promo on Paige when Jay White interrupts and once again issues the statement that he will not be defending his belt against Cole at the pay-per-view because Cole lost to Paige twice and he's an undeserving challenger. And then after leaving Cole to piss in the wind, he walks all the way down to the ring to confront Paige to essentially spout the same thing. He won't be defending his belt against him either. Which did kind of get me thinking. So, the story that we're led to believe is that Jay White flew himself all the way from Japan to the States just so he could show up on AEW with theme music and all to say that he's not defending the belt at the pay-per-view. Seems like a complete waste of a plane ticket if you ask me. Couldn't you just shoot a video from home, send it to Tony, and have him aired as a pre-tape on Dynamite? But as we've now learned, Jay White will in fact be defending the belt at the pay-per-view because White and Cole are double teaming on Paige, and Cole's about to clock Paige with the IWGP belt when who should come out but Kazuchika Okada in a t-shirt and joggers, looking like he was ready to go grocery shopping. And they all had a pretty weak-looking four-way brawl, and not in this segment, but later on in the show is when they announced Paige versus Cole versus White versus Okada for the IWGP title. I presume Jay White is retaining. Or Okada wins it back, because if anything from watching New Japan has taught us in the last several years, everything is usually lol Okada wins anyway. Jade Cargill is looking for new baddies. Red Velvet is apparently injured. Chris Statlander and Athena are not very good actors, and I still have no idea who Willow Nightingale is, other than she just randomly appeared on Rampage for no reason and had a sloppy match with Jade. And God help us all, when we all thought the women's roster couldn't get any worse, Marina Shafir is back. And personally, I don't care if she's wrestling Toni Storm, Thunder Rosa, Serena Deeb, or fucking Trish Stratus. I ain't sticking around to watch another Marina match. At least not anytime soon. The only place she needs to be sticking around is a training center with Roderick Strong so he can teach her how to do a decent drop-down hip toss spot. Or maybe how to do a decent collar and elbow tie-up. Or a headlock. Oh yeah, and Nyla Rose is now aligned with Marina. Just because, I guess. There was something in here about Sting and Darby teaming up with Shingo and Hiromu to wrestle someone. I think the Beta Bucks, although I'm not entirely sure, nor do I really care. And for every casual wrestling fan out there that does not follow New Japan, and you're all wondering to yourselves, who are these guys that Darby and Sting are bringing in? Don't worry about it. Doesn't matter. And the main event is Chris Jericho and Lance Archer versus Jon Moxley and Hiroshi Tanahashi. Because that's what we want to see, right? The two guys that are going to be headlining a pay-per-view against each other are teaming up on the go-home show. I wrote virtually nothing down about this match at all. I was struggling to stay awake by this point in the show. Kind of like how Tanahashi was struggling to do anything physical in this match. My God, is that guy's body beat up. Probably should flash off some warning bells about putting him in the ring with the president of Garbage Outlaw Wrestling Incorporated. Tanahashi won with the high fly flow. And of course, we had the stupid afterbirth fight, which went from every normal, meaningless fake brawl we see 1,000 times on the show in a given week to becoming the most comical thing on the entire show. Because after the match, a bunch of guys start filing out and fighting around ringside. It's absolute bedlam and chaos for like 3 minutes straight. There's guys getting thrown into guardrails, guys smashing each other over the head with chairs, people throwing popcorn at one another, tipping over steps, fucking setting the ring posts on fire. I think at one point I saw a loose car tire rolling and chasing Sammy Guevara around ringside. And while there's this fucking Black Friday shopping stampede going on outside the ring, Moxley and Tanahashi are just calmly standing in the ring looking at each other and completely ignoring everything that is going on around them. And the reason it's so goddamn funny is that while they're completely blocking out all this bullshit that's going on at ringside, at no point during this outside melee does the action ever spill into the ring so that Tanahashi and Mox would have to stop engaging in a stare down to actually do anything. They're just calmly standing in the ring, having a nice little conversation, probably talking about where they're going to meet up after the show to do dinner. Maybe a nice little chat about meeting up for coffee on Saturday morning before the pay-per-view just to shoot the shit and catch up with each other. All the while, there's a fucking street fight going on outside the ring. Died laughing at this. And by the way, do I even need to bring up the obvious gaping plot hole with Tony booking a match to crown an interim AEW World Champion, where the entire premise going in is there's a chance that a guy from another company can win the belt and take it with him to Japan and we won't see him for a period of time? Now, of course, it's not going to happen because that would be fucking dumb. But even planting the idea in people's minds that it could happen, why would you even risk that possibility? What is the point of crowning an interim AEW World Champion if the AEW Champion ends up being a New Japan guy who's not actively on the show for weeks, if not months at a time? I mean, by that point, Punk would be back from injury and the whole thing would have been completely pointless. Obviously, it makes no sense, and I don't think anyone's ever brought this up as a talking point, which is kind of sad. But again, it reverts back to how low we've set the standards in the business. And I don't know about you, but I'm looking forward to Sunday's pay-per-view in about the same way I look forward to going to see my dentist every 6 months. Not that I have bad hygiene or anything, but it's like, okay. It's on the schedule, so guess we got to endure it. Meanwhile, my main interest on this show was centered around a promo segment that had nothing to do with the actual pay-per-view, but could actually make the company some real money if they don't fuck it up like they do everything else. Where's Wardlow, by the way? Anyone want to try and defend how much they butchered that guy's booking since the Double or Nothing fallout? God, Punk and MJF can't get back any sooner. So anyway, let's move on with the retro portion of the weekly show. NWA World Championship Wrestling, June 21st, 1986. We are very much approaching the peak of the Great American Bash Tour at this point. And in one of the greatest opening teasers we've seen on the show thus far, we get Jim Cornette in the ring on an episode of Worldwide TV, about to do battle with legendary NWA jobber Randy Mulkey. It's funny because I was listening to one of the Experience or Drive-Thru podcasts recently. I can't remember which one it was. It was one of his older episodes. But Jim and Brian were poking fun at the Mulkey brothers. And I noticed that it wasn't the first time that I had heard Corny take low blows at the Mulkeys. I'm sitting there wondering, what is it about Randy and Bill Mulkey that Cornette loves taking flippant pot shots at those guys? And they're certainly not the worst cast of jobbers we've seen on the studio shows. I'd still say Lee Peak is among the worst. And then I see Cornette about to have a one-on-one match with Randy Mulkey, and I figured maybe he thought he could actually take him? Because it sure looked like Cornette could have a semi-competitive match with the guy. I mean, they're practically the same height and build. So, obviously there was more to come with this later on, but right before they went to the opening graphics, Baby Doll ran in from the bottom frame of the camera, so they were leaving us with the cliffhanger that Baby Doll got into a physical altercation with Corny. We'll talk about that more when we get to it. Then we cut to the booth for an opening promo with the Russians, and they're essentially plugging their upcoming Bash Tour matches. Nikita's talking about how Magnum TA showed no respect when he decked Ivan Koloff with the United States title last week, and basically saying he can't wait to get in the ring with him. And the funniest thing about this entire exchange is that I think I understood more of Nikita's broken English than whatever Ivan was droning on about for ages. All I remember is I started paying attention to Ivan, and I blanked out for like 10 seconds thinking about something else. And when I zoned back in, Ivan was still talking. I completely neglected to go back and figure out what he said. But honestly, I did not really care. Something about Nikita showing Magnum a lesson in respect, and I think he name-dropped Dusty a time or two. And then we had the Rock and Roll Express beat Ray Aaron and Mike Simani with a double drop kick in like 20 seconds. I don't even think the new guy, Ray Aaron, did anything except stand on the apron and be completely useless here. Then we immediately cut back to the booth for the greatest Horseman promo of all time. I dug Ole's t-shirt that read, "Damn, I am good." Wouldn't dispute that for a minute. And they're all there, once again plugging and promoting their upcoming programs for the Bash Tour. Tully says that now with the Horsemen back in full effect, no one's going to stop them. Arn says that the Horsemen don't make promises that their asses can't back up. And it's all very basic heel promo delivery. And then Flair shows up from virtually out of nowhere and does the Ric Flair thing, as I wrote down here. He starts by essentially saying that all the babyfaces are too afraid to show up to the studio now that all the four horsemen are back together wreaking havoc. And then things get awesome because Flair starts taking jabs at the Road Warriors. He refers to them as Animal and Road Warrior Big Bird Hawk, which immediately prompts all the heels to engage in a simultaneous hearty laugh. And Ric Flair, totally proud of himself for making this horrifically bad joke, responds by going, "That was a good one, wasn't it?" So he then proceeds to repeat the joke and run it into the ground. Again, fantastic, because he's a heel, and this is the exact kind of thing that heels should do. Make totally unwitty, terrible jokes that only the heels would find funny, and then completely go over the top with it to the point where you just roll your eyes at the whole thing. And while Flair is going on his little tangent, they all stick their hands in together to do the team huddle thing. And the best part, right before they cap it off, Flair says that if there's any female between the ages of 18 to 28 who doesn't wear a training bra and wants to find out what a real man is like, she can give Rick a call for a good time. To which they immediately cut the camera to a young female in the front row who I believe was checking under her shirt to apparently learn that she was not, in fact, wearing a training bra. So perhaps she would qualify. We had another empty arena promo with Dusty. So I guess Flair was right. The babyfaces are apparently too afraid to show up to the studio to cut their own promos because this would be the second week in a row where Dusty is going incognito for his promos. Either that or he was quarantining. And he's mostly talking about his feud with Ole and how someday, somewhere, and somehow their storied rivalry must come to an end. Even though Dusty had preached to us and declared that the feud with him and Ole will never be over. And while he's talking about how him and Ole need to ride on another planet, he informs us that he has saved the stratosphere to resolve their issues. To which I wrote down, Dusty reserved the stratosphere so that Ole and Dusty could settle their long-standing rivalry in a pro wrestling match? So what, did he take out a loan? Did he call NASA? Personally, I'd like to know what a Dusty versus Ole match would look like in space. Factoring in that they'd be defying gravity, how would one execute a body slam or much less take a bump in space? Better yet, how do you pin a guy's shoulders down? I mean, we've seen just about every other stupid gimmick match in the history of wrestling. I'm sure someone would figure out how to do a falls count anywhere in space match. What in the fuck were we talking about? Aside from Dusty talking about space and stratospheres and living on the end of a lightning bolt. I've got nothing. And we had Jimmy Valiant in the Raging Bull versus a new set of job guys, Pat Myers and Clement Fields. By the way, I should have covered this at the beginning, but as you will quickly find out, what with the show only having about a 45-minute runtime, of course that's excluding commercials, there was not a single wrestling match on this show that went more than 60 seconds. So my notes on these matches are pretty much chalked up to whatever the finish was. Whoever this Clement guy was, his role in this match featured the single job of taking an Irish whip off of the ropes so that Bull could hit him with a flying burrito. He still managed to fuck up the bump. So then, cutting to the booth, we had Jim Cornette and Big Bubba out. And it begins with Cornette making a joke about finding one of Baby Doll's dresses in the back of his used car that he just purchased. And the obvious joke here is that it's a very large dress. Because, you know, well, you fill in the blank. So anyway, this is great because Corny's trying to get the production crew to fire up the rest of the video from what we saw in the opening segment. And they're taking forever to get the video rolling. So Cornette starts improvising to try and cover up for dead air time because he's a genius. And while he's ad-libbing, one of his lines that he drops is the famous, "Get the camera on me, it's a safe bet every time" quote. Which I could have sworn he stole from one of the boys who used that in the territories. For some reason, I want to say it was Jerry Lawler in Memphis, but I could be entirely wrong about that. So eventually they get everything queued up, and they go through the opening deal where Cornette's cutting the promo on Malky, and they're about to have what I presume to have been something resembling a pro wrestling match. And that is when Baby Doll, of course, makes her run in to try and get into the fight with Corny. And upon entering the ring, I think I've now figured out why Randy Malky is at the butt end of all of Cornette's jokes. Because Baby Doll runs into the ring, Randy turns around and she proceeds to give him a belly-to-belly suplex and lays him out like a total geek. And Big Bubba immediately grabs a hold of her so they can tease Cornette getting some more heat on her. But Dusty ends up running in with one of those gimmicked wooden folding chairs. And this is actually a pretty pivotal moment for the career of Big Bubba, because not only is it the first real engagement between him and Dusty, but with the angle they shot here, Dusty gives Bubba the headshot with a chair, breaks it over Bubba's head, completely shattering the chair in a million pieces. And, well, it's hilarious because the whole idea behind the angle is that Bubba is not supposed to sell the chair shot. But I'm sitting here laughing my ass off watching this because while Bubba has the chair wrapped around his neck, his top hat starts to tilt over to the side. So after he removes the remnants of the chair, there's just wood splattered all over the place. He has to adjust his hat to recenter it. I watched it back like 5 or 6 times in a row. Died every time I went back and watched it. So, well, he goes to remove his suit jacket. Teases he's going to get into the brawl with Dusty. But then the segment gets even wackier because out runs Magnum to even the odds a little bit. And what should he be carrying out with him but a shovel? Now, it wasn't gold like Cody Rhodes' golden burial shovel we saw in that ladder match on AEW earlier in the year, but of all weapons for Magnum to bring in here to run off Cornette and Bubba, his weapon of choice is a shovel. An odd choice, to say the very least. As noted, though, that pre-tape was probably one of Bubba's first major TV moments, aside from when he debuted the character on TV for the first time. First of all, it's a very famous TV angle that every lover of old school wrestling remembers because it was so preposterous. But it kickstarted Bubba's program with Dusty, which carried over into '87 when they obviously did the big cage match in my hometown of Pittsburgh. Unfortunately, I wasn't born yet, so I didn't get to see it live. To my recollection, I don't know if my brothers ever saw that live either. It's highly unlikely because one of them I know was living in Baltimore at the time. The other, I think he was in Ohio doing graduate school. But, yeah. Regardless, great bit of TV history here. And then coming back from the break, we had probably the biggest shock TV moment of the 80s. So Cornette's still at the booth, getting ready to introduce Eaton and Condrey for their match. And Cornette begins by making a joke about Baby Doll having bad luck last week. And to tell you the truth, I'm not exactly sure if I'm even allowed to say this on YouTube without getting flagged. Let's just say Cornette used an R word that describes forced unlawful penetration. But the punchline to the story is that when the robber broke into her house, she yelled the word. The robber yelled, "No!" And, well, first off, you have to understand what makes the Bubba Rogers-Jim Cornette pairing so fantastic, especially if you listen to corny stories about him. Basically, the nutshell summary of it is that Cornette would intentionally try to get Bubba to crack during his promo segments, and because Bubba's entire shtick was that he was supposed to be a stone-faced bodyguard, completely expressionless, it's the exact kind of gimmick that you don't want to be seen smiling. So Cornette would intentionally make jokes during his promos to try and see if he could get Bubba to break kayfabe, if merely for like a split second. And because Bubba was so fucking awesome, he never did. So, God love him for it. Part of me was assuming that is why he dropped the line in here about Baby Doll, but, you know, we go back and watch these shows and we talk about things that absolutely would not pass on TV in 2022. That entire promo segment, yeah, that would have been cut and would have never seen the light of day if it had happened on a wrestling program in modern times. So then the Midnights wrestled Sam Houston and Rocky Kernodle. And after just hearing Cornette make a passing gag about forcible molestation, they just kind of moved on with the rest of the show like it was good Christian TV. Just moving right along with things. And then the Midnights won in about 30 seconds after Eaton hit a diving elbow. We then had a Bash Tour update. Only thing I wrote down about it is that they were adding Richmond, Virginia to the touring cities of the Bash. Most notably, they were going to be visiting the Richmond Coliseum. And that immediately leads to an interview with Baby Doll, who... I figured she'd have something to retort about Courtney's sexual harassment comments in the previous promo. No, instead her retort to Cornette had to do with the dress that he pulled out from the bag, saying she was too classy to wear something as hideous as that dress. And beyond that, she promised that even though she's a woman, she knows that she can beat Cornette in a wrestling match. And then Magnum followed suit to do a fiery babyface promo on Nikita, with veins popping, blood levels rising, and spit flying. He vowed that he'll take care of Nikita in 4 straight matches in their best of 7 to reclaim his U.S. heavyweight belt. And as noted from last week, with Magnum doing a promo very similar to this one, where he was just firing on all cylinders and going into super passionate babyface mode. If you know Magnum's promo history, and you think back to where that guy first started in Mid-South with his ability to talk, and you compare it to just a couple years later in Crockett Promotions, night and day, bro. Night and day. And then Magnum beat Paul Garner with the belly-to-belly in 15 seconds after the commercial. Got the biggest pop of the entire show. And then Wahoo McDaniel did a very milquetoast promo on Jimmy Garvin, essentially promising him that he was going to whip him to death in their Indian strap match. It's literally all I got out of it. Other than Wahoo explaining the rules of the match and him bringing up the touching all 4 corners of the ring post in succession, which I always thought was such a stupid gimmick in strap matches. Just a lame stipulation. Then we cut back to the ring so that Ron Garvin could beat Vernon Deaton in T-minus 30 seconds with the knockout punch. After the break, we had Ric Flair out for another promo, and this time he was in ring gear because he was going to be wrestling later on. Or so we were led to believe at the time. And while he's plugging the fact that he's going to be wrestling later on, and that he's such a nice guy, he will not even cover charge people $50 to see him wrestle, unlike Dusty. And he's also mocking Dusty for trying to claim to be the #1 wrestler and sports attraction in the world when Flair is the one sporting the big gold belt. And he promised he was going to run through all top 14 contenders during the Bash Tour to keep his title. And right before moving on to the next segment, I capped off my notes by writing down, that was a very good babyface promo from the top heel. Ole and Arn wrestled the Mulkey brothers. Okay, so maybe Cornette's pot shots at the Mulkeys aren't totally unjustified. Anderson's won in about a minute after Ole hit a flying knee off the top rope and then tapped out one of the Mulkeys with an armbar. Then we had a fantastic promo with Jimmy Garvin and Precious. Steve Regal was also there, but he was just kind of in the periphery. And the main gist of the entire thing was that Jimmy is not sweating Wahoo McDaniel at all in their Indian strap match. He is totally unconcerned about being hooked to the other end of an 8-foot leather strap with a wild 300-pound uncaged animal going after him. Precious did have a great line in this promo, though, because while she has all the faith in the world that Garvin will not have a problem beating Wahoo like a dog, there is the problem of Garvin being able to carry around that big whale to touch all 4 corners of the ring posts. But never fear, because Gorgeous Jimmy has got this. He's not scared, though. Yeah, Jimmy Garvin was great, for those of you that have not already are caught on to this. Ronnie, on the other hand, we might need to have a conversation about that one. But for sure, gorgeous Jimmy Garvin was the man. And speaking of the man, we had the Paul Jones Army at the booth for a promo. And I know every single fucking week I review a Paul Jones segment, I constantly say it's the best Paul Jones segment of all time. Okay, I actually mean that here. This might have been my favorite Paul Jones Army skit yet. And it's fantastic because it starts with Paul Jones just kind of aimlessly wandering in thought for about a minute. You could clearly tell he's trying to come up with material to talk about for this promo, which is kind of the one humorous thing about Paul Jones, period. The fact that the guy was never really a good promo to begin with, but that's also kind of what made him so remarkable. And while he's in the middle of his ranting, they once again put up the graphic of the bald Paul Jones on screen, and in the middle of his dialogue, he stops his train of thought and goes, "Look at that! Look at that! I can't stand it!" And he's screaming at the top of his lungs, "Jimmy Valiant, you're gonna be a bald-headed geek, and I never want to see that image on television ever again." And all the while, you got Shaska Watley, the Barbarian, and Baron Von Raschke all in the background just being the most wacky, lunatic, over-the-top cartoon characters you've ever seen on a wrestling show. It's fucking phenomenal. And then Baron did a promo vowing that he was going to knock out Valiant with a loaded black glove. You know, the more I think about it, I'm going to be very sad whenever this Paul Jones Army stuff ends. As much as it's all infamously bad television, it's also sort of become my favorite material to cover in these retro reviews. Like, anytime I see Paul Jones and his goofball cast of cartoon characters, I at least know I'm going to be solidly entertained. There is a charm to these segments, regardless of your opinion on the history. And then we had the best closer in TBS studio wrestling history. We were supposed to get Ric Flair versus Tony Zane, but in the ultimate swerve of all swerves, out comes Road Warrior Hawk to confront Flair, which I was very bummed to see because the idea of Ric Flair wrestling Tony Zane actually intrigued me. And he's overpowering Flair in the ring for a few seconds before picking up in a press slam position and dumping him over the top rope onto Arn and Tully on the outside. It was also an extremely sketchy landing because I'm like 90% sure that Arn and Tully didn't actually catch him properly, which meant that Flair basically took a bump onto the concrete. Ugh. Bad times. So Ole ends up jumping Hawk from behind, and the Horsemen eventually start all ganging up on Hawk. That brings out Animal and Paul Ellering to try and make the save, but their run-in attempts were immediately thwarted. Animal also took a nasty spill onto the concrete where he just kind of fell off the ring apron and landed ribs first on the ground. God, the bumps these guys used to take on the cement. It's just brutal. And the Horsemen end up giving Animal the triple-assisted pile driver on the floor. And that was immediately followed with the Horsemen giving Hawk a triple-assisted gourd buster in the ring, which, for those of you that don't have the Peacock Network, go on YouTube and search for this episode, because I know for a fact that someone has archived most of these 605 Superstations for WCW. It's the June 21st edition. Skip to like the last segment here. They go to hoist up Hawk for this move, and right before Ole and Tully let go, Arn is trying to single-handedly hold up Hawk overhead in the suplex position, but you can also tell that he was starting to lose his grip because Hawk's legs were dangling behind Arn's head, which led me to think, oh my god, Arn is about to break this guy's neck and kill him on live television. Somehow he managed to power through and safely drop Hawk on his stomach, but if you freeze frame the shot at the right time, Hawk was probably a split moment away from having something go horribly wrong here. So, well, they ended up replaying the entire angle in the last few minutes of the show, and while they're showing everything in full, Hawk is at the booth doing a promo, essentially vowing that Flair was going to die in Philadelphia during the Bash Tour because everything that just transpired helped Hawk to bring out a deep hatred that he's not experienced in a long time. And right before the show ended, I finished my notes with the following statement: best promo of 1986, possibly the best closing segment for studio wrestling in 1986. It almost made up for them dick teasing me with Ric Flair versus Tony Zane and not delivering. Come on, how cruel can you be with false advertising, man? It's the match of a lifetime for Tony Zane, and you can't give it to him. The show's kind of difficult to grade because it was very short. The matches were completely futile. I'm not going to dispute that for a minute. This is all about angles and building up as much hype for the Bash Tour as possible. And especially with that final segment, it was executed perfectly. I mean, thinking about it for a minute, the runtime for this show is very similar to how Rampage runs on Friday nights. I mean, if Rampage was more like this show, where we got more promos and TV angles, you throw in the occasional squash match here and there to actually elevate some talent, I'd be more on board than their status quo, let's do a bunch of back and forth meaningless wrestling with undercard guys that no one gives a fuck about. I mean, this would be an episode of television that Tony ought to look back in the archives and take into consideration when he's piecing that program together. All right, so as touched on in last week's Retro Series rundown of World Class, this particular episode was the first of the tape delay airings of the June Star Wars event at Reunion Arena. They had taped the actual show in full on June 17th, and interestingly enough, you can actually find the full-length original 2-hour broadcast on YouTube if you just plug it into the search engine. Interesting little tidbit about the show. Obviously, there had been the feuds that they were building up on television with the regulars, the Von Erichs, the Freebirds, Jim Garvin, the Iceman, etc. But they had also taped several prelim matches that they actually would not end up airing on the Dallas TV shows. But they had a series of crossover inter-promotional matches from All Japan that they filmed as part of the original event. And what's cool is that if you watch a show on YouTube, or you just so happen to have a copy of the original taping of the event, the All Japan matches were all delivered with full Japanese commentary. Even the graphics for everything were in the Japanese Unicode format, so unless you were fluid in the Japanese language and you understood the fonts and everything, you were basically left to watch the match and completely ignore the commentary or graphics for the whole thing. Obviously, we won't be covering those matches because they're not going to air on the television shows during the next couple weeks, but the full card is on the wiki page right now if you wanted to check it out. One of the matches they filmed was Johnny Mantell versus Genichiro Tenryu. God, I hope I didn't butcher that name. And Tenryu, for those that didn't know, he had actually trained with Dory and Terry Funk in the Dallas region in the late 70s, so he was a pretty familiar name in the region. Elsewhere in the prelim stuff, there was a women's match between Vicky Carranza and Lola Gonzalez. Two names I'm unfamiliar with, but again, no names in the Dallas region. There was a Jumbo Tsuruta versus Ted DiBiase match for the NWA United National Championship. There was also a Pacific Wrestling Federation title match between then-champion Giant Baba and challenger King Kong Bundy. And I believe the PWF title was property of All Japan, which would make sense considering Giant Baba was the owner of All Japan. Really interesting stuff. It would probably behoove of me to go out of my way to try and watch some of these interpromotional matches at some point, considering I love classic wrestling content and I'm always looking to catch up on some of the legends and greats of the past. I mean, anything involving the old Ted DiBiase matches are a surefire win. I had seen a lot of his work in Mid-South from 81 and 82, saw a little bit of his stuff down in the Georgia region when he was working with the Freebirds, but as far as his work goes from Japan, I don't think I've ever seen anything from him there. Maybe a few clips, but nothing too extensive. wish I had 24 hours in a day to just sit back and binge watch as much classic wrestling content as I can, but, you know, gotta do that life thing. One of the matches they taped, the first one that they aired on this particular episode, a 6-man tag with Jose Lothario, Chris Adams, and Chavo Guerrero defeating the team of Wild Bill Irwin, Fishman, who appeared to be a masked luchador, and, as I wrote down here, the Mongols' weird-looking sheep robe, or whatever that weird entrance garb was. I also determined that the Fishman had to have been the great-grandfather of Shark Boy. Generally, as a match, there's really not a whole lot to say about it. Fishman and Chavo did some not-so-great-looking lucha spots at the beginning. Most of the fault pointed in the direction of the Fishman, who was not very good. Lots of frequent tags, back-and-forth action. I did take note that they had 2 officials in this match. One was Bronco Lubick. The other one, I wasn't sure. He was in a polo shirt, though. It's kind of a lost art in the business to have multiple referees calling matches at a given time. Christ, with the amount of multi-mans we see in today's business, where it's just pandemonium and nonsensical chaos for the entire match, you think they would have more than one official. I mean, it would make sense. Overall, though, it's a fun crowd pleaser. In modern insider terminology, we'd probably say this is a good curtain jerker. You know, hot match to put the baby faces over and sort of warm up the crowd early on. Finish saw Mongol give Lothario an atomic drop, but while Mongol had Lothario elevated overhead, he had reached out to tag in Chavo, who immediately came down with a crossbody dive onto Mongol for the 3. One of the heels also kicked the cameraman over in the process, trying to break up the fall, so that was pretty grand. And then we had our hair-raising conversation with the Freebirds prior to Buddy Roberts' hair match with the Iceman. Get it? Hair-raising talk? Because it's a hair match? I love bad puns. And as we saw from watching the television shows, they had been building this feud up, starting with Roberts cutting off a piece of the Iceman's dreadlock in an angle. So as they're running through the clips to show the replay, Mark Lawrence, who's conducting the promo with the two of them, goes to show the subsequent angle about a week or 2 later, where the Iceman had returned the favor by cutting off a clump of Buddy's hair. And it's perfect because, like great heels are supposed to do, back when they used to have a clue how to be actual characters, while Lorenz is trying to catch people up to speed about the Iceman getting a little bit of redemption on Buddy, Hayes goes, "Wait a second, we don't need to show that clip. Why do we even have that queued up?" But this is a fantastic pre-tape. Obviously, they had thrown the wacky little story on the Go Home show during that Freebird segment where Buddy said he had a special vanishing cream that he was going to wipe away all the hair from Parsons, should he be able to smear it on his head. I believe he said in this promo, it is not approved by the pharmaceutical companies. Word. And Buddy capped off everything perfectly here when he assured that after he's through with him tonight, he's no longer going to call himself Mr. T, but he's going to call himself Mr. B, because that stands for bald. Thanks, Buddy. No way any smart person was going to be able to piece that together. And then we immediately follow that with the Texas Heavyweight title match between Gorgeous Jimmy Garvin and David Von Erich. Again, following in the Retro Series, the belt had been held up after the controversial finish to the original Garvin-David TV match from a couple weeks back, where Sunshine had run interference and ended up fucking the whole thing up, which did call into question why they didn't add a stipulation to the match beforehand to try and ban Sunshine from ringside. And knowing damn good and well she was probably going to try and stir something up here, but we'll get to it momentarily. It's a very technically sound match. Once again, Sunshine's facial expressions at ringside are probably the sole highlight of the entire match. Even Bill Mercer noted at one point that Sunshine's facials can tell the entire story of a match. and that's probably true. No joke, they could have kept the camera on Sunshine the entire match, never having filmed anything Garvin and David were doing in the ring, and by purely watching Sunshine react to what was going on, I could easily tell you who was in control in the ring. That is how good she was. Another one of those things you pick up on as you get older and you start getting smart to the business. There's a spot right before the comeback where Garvin has David on the mat in a chin lock, and there's enough dead air time with Mercer not calling the action where if you actually listen in, you can hear David calling the comeback spots from the ground. I didn't catch the whole dialogue they were having, but I definitely heard the words shoot off and something involving sleeper. And sure enough, less than a minute later, they're doing the spot. Nothing wrong with it, but again, things I never would have picked up on as a kid, and now that I'm watching back 20-something odd years later, I start picking up on the small things. And the finish is great. Well, initial finish, I should say. Garvin goes to pin David near the ropes, but David's feet are positioned in such a way where they're extended toward the bottom rope, so while Bronco is counting the pin, he does not see that Sunshine is holding David's feet down from the outside. So at first we're all thinking, God damn it, the babyface got screwed again. It's a second time that no good Sunshine helped Garvin pull one over on David Von Erich. But since the event had a set of crossover talent from other territories around the country, there were also multiple NWA officials watching the match throughout. And when they come back from break, Mark Lawrence announces that the officials had seen what had gone down before the bell, and they all met in the back to determine that the belt will once again be held up until a later date where they can sanction a rematch between the two. Which I did kind of find funny how in the middle of this live special, the NWA officials held an impromptu meeting to determine that the Texas Heavyweight title must be held up because of a heel cheating to win. Because God forbid we let the bad guy have his moment in the sun for 24 hours before we just relinquish it from him again. Not the Texas Heavyweight title, man. Nah, that belt is too prestigious to be settled with the heel cheating to win. Gotta send the Dallas faithful home happy, you see. This is all great, though. Especially Garvin reacting to everything in the ring. Just throwing a tantrum, screaming that it's all a conspiracy and that he was wronged. I mean, I know it's a cliche at this point. I feel like I bring this talking point up every single week we talk about these classic shows, but this is by the books professional wrestling done right. It's not overcomplicated. It's easily digestible, and de facto, it's easy to follow. And when wrestling is simple, it's normally when it's at its best. That's why MJF shit used to be the best part of AEW every week, because it was easy to follow, we knew what his character was, and every story he was involved with had clear-cut ebb and flow from start to finish. And that's why without him, AEW is complete dog shit because nothing makes sense on a week-to-week basis, and there's too much irrational, unexplained insider BS going on all the time. There's no ebb and flow to anything, and the only people that know what's going on are the same 150 people that are watching New Japan right now. It's also a good reflection of why the ratings are where they're at. So then we got the hair versus hair match with Buddy Roberts and the Iceman in the main event, where the end game is to make someone a bald-headed geek. Match itself was unremarkable, to say the very least. Crowd was obviously going ballistic for everything the Iceman did in this match, but that's to be expected. Everything was all about the finish and the post-match angle, and this went down almost exactly how you'd envision it to go down, with the goal being to humiliate the heel in the end. The finish sees Buddy roll up the Iceman by grabbing his tights, so initially you see the heel go over. We also saw a blurred censoring of the Iceman's bare ass, which I appreciated them taking the time to censor that. And of course, David Manning's getting the reaction from the crowd where the people are trying to let him know that Buddy just cheated. So Buddy goes to grab the removal cream from the outside, but David Manning snatches it from him. And the Iceman immediately starts laying into him. And the big angle here sees Buddy get the cream wiped on his head. And out comes Michael Hayes with a towel to throw it over Buddy's head. And he tries to get into the brief scuffle with the Iceman, but Hayes is quickly run off. And again, going back to the well with it, but I'll say it again just to drive the point home further. Perfect professional wrestling storytelling. The heel wins through nefarious means, but he ends up getting his comeuppance in the end after his plan gets thwarted. And now the fallout from all this is seeing what Buddy Roberts looks like with a shaved head on Dallas TV. I guess now we can call him Baldy Roberts. Huh? I thought it was funny. Maybe that's a good point to just put this one to bed now that I've completely ruined any and all credibility I've ever obtained on this channel. Overall, it's a very fun show. This is just the beginning. Got another round of Star Wars matches for the upcoming show next week, so we'll have that to look forward to. Definitely check this one out. Even if you are not a fan of All Japan or any of that stuff, at least go out of your way to watch the world-class promoted matches on YouTube, because they're worth it. And we'll be back on Monday for the next podcast installment. Thanks for stopping in. Make sure to check out the show each Monday and Friday for new shows and new material on the FSWR podcast. As for Monday's show, obviously we'll be more than likely glancing over AEW Rampage in passing, and we'll also be talking about NWA's next Power Edition, hopefully with less discussion of the aces and eights. And of course, we got the AEW Forbidden Door pay-per-view that we're going to be cough reviewing. How much of it I even want to spend time talking about, that's really up in the air right now. As we talked about during that whole opening montage with the Observer clip, the build to the show has been fucking atrocious. And I think at this stage, the only people that are actually going to plunk out the money to buy that piece of shit show are the true AEW loyalists that are going to support that company until the day it finally dies a horrible death and gets buried into the grave. Because I don't know who else in their right mind would willingly dish out $50 to order that pay-per-view. So, and we'll see how it all pays off. My prediction is not well, and considering I didn't even bother dedicating a portion of the show to do a preview predictions rundown, that should tell you my level of care when it comes to that show. And it also hit me while I was perusing Peacock in the last couple days. Apparently, WWE's Money in the Bank show is coming up next weekend. So I guess that'll cover the third segment for the following Monday podcast. I had totally forgotten Money in the Bank was even a thing. Much less forgot it was its own standalone pay-per-view. But, sure. We'll go with that. I wonder what underwhelming mid-card swerve they'll come up with this go-around to win the briefcase and carry it around for a year, only to end up doing multiple jobs in the meantime. Isn't that kind of the tradition of the Money in the Bank holders in WWE? He who holds the briefcase is doomed to do a million jobs on TV for no apparent reason. But we'll try and stay positive, because God knows wrestling's giving us anything to stay positive about these days. Take care, all. Peace.